Welcome to the 19th event in the Will Miller Social Justice Lecture Series. I thank all of you for coming to tonight's lecture by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. We are fortunate that she was able to fit us into her incredibly busy schedule to come to Vermont to talk about an Indigenous people's history and the roots of America's endless wars. Ben Dangle from Toward Freedom will introduce Roxanne when I've completed my introduction to the lecture series. This lecture series was created in honor and in memory of my husband, Will Miller, a social justice activist and professor of philosophy who taught at UVM for 35 years. I'm pleased to say that Roxanne and Will had the good fortune to meet in 2003 here at UVM at a conference on imperialism, which was helped to be organized by one of our board members, Fred Magdoff, in honor of his father, Harry Magdoff. Roxanne spoke at that conference. As our logo for the lecture series says, Will always be remembered as a clear voice in a world of false words and disinformation. Our mission, which Will helped to construct, brings speakers to the UVM campus and the Burlington community to provide a continuing program of radical analysis of social, ecological, and political concerns. Will would have appreciated each of our presenters and would have enjoyed meeting them, talking to them, and debating them. As a social justice activist, he offered a reasoned and insightful analysis into the origins and workings of capitalism and imperialism, giving us both a call to struggle and a vision for a more just society. He helped us to understand topics that we felt were too big to understand, just as each of our lectures has done. We were incredibly lucky to have him in our lives for as long as we did. Will's voice was powerful. He had an unwavering commitment to the struggle against war and for social justice. Will would be inspired by the UVM faculty members, staff, and students who are continuing to speak out in the name of social justice, both on and off campus. I'd like to recognize the board of the lecture series for their work to help determine topics for the lectures and for their help in finding speakers who are current on the issues that Will would want us to be discussing. Our current board members are Helen Scott, Fred Magdoff, Mike Cassidy, Ron Jacobs, and myself. We do this work with generous support from people like yourselves who make donations to the lecture series. Thank you for helping to assist us in keeping Will's legacy alive by making a contribution tonight in the containers at the exit doors or by mailing us a contribution. We also have t-shirts, books by previous speakers, and Roxanne's latest book for sale at a table outside the door. We will scoot Roxanne out to the table at the end of her talk so she can sign copies of her book. So please let her get out to the lobby when we're all done. A few UVM departments and organizations have sponsored this event. We are grateful to the Departments of History and Sociology. United Academics, UVM's faculty union, is a generous sponsor of the lecture series. UVM's chapter of the International Socialist Organization was extremely helpful in making this lecture possible. Over the years, I have neglected to mention the support that CCTV, local channel 17, gives to these lectures. Not only have they filmed almost every event, they air the lectures multiple times, and they are also available online. They give a second life to each of our lectures, and we appreciate them greatly. Global Justice Ecology Project and the Will Miller Green Mountain Veterans for Peace chapter have also sponsored this lecture. At this point, I'd like to acknowledge the passing of one of the leaders and founding members of Green Mountain Vets for Peace. Bert Thompson died this past week due to health complications associated with diabetes. He was an amazingly strong advocate for veterans and a peace activist who worked locally and nationally to inspire people to speak up when outraged, stop wars, and organize to expose the wastefulness of military spending. Bert rarely missed a lecture and was here with his signature warmth and was at most events with his signature warmth and generosity. Those of us who knew him are mourning his loss and missing him greatly. I had intended to have a picture of him here, and I wasn't able to figure out the technology to do that. A few years ago, I began the tradition of reading a favorite poem of ours at lecture series events. I find this poem, written by Howard Zinn, another extraordinary social justice activist and university professor and friend of Roxanne's. This poem is inspiring in trying times, which regretfully never seem to end. On Getting By in Difficult Times by Howard Zinn. You ask how I managed to stay involved and remain seemingly happy and adjusted to this awful world where the efforts of caring people pale in comparison to those who have power. It's easy. First, don't let those who have power intimidate you. No matter how much power they have, they cannot prevent you from living your life, speaking your mind, thinking independently, having relationships with people as you like. Read Emma Goldman's autobiography, Living My Life. Harassed, even imprisoned by authority, she insisted on living her life, speaking out however she felt. Second, find companions who have your values, your commitments, but who also have a sense of humor. That combination is necessary. Third, notice how precise my advice, that I can confidently number it, the way scientists number things. Understand that the major media will not tell you of all the acts of resistance taking place every day, the strikes, the protests, the individual acts of courage in the face of authority. Look, and you will certainly find it, for evidence of these unreported acts. And for the little you find, extrapolate from that and assume there must be 1,000 times as much as what you have found. Fourth, note that throughout history, people have felt powerless before authority, but that at certain times, these powerless people, by organizing, acting, risking, persisting, have created enough power to change the world around them, even if only a little or briefly. Fifth, remember, those who have power and who seem invulnerable are in fact quite vulnerable. Their power depends on the obedience of others. And when those others begin withholding that obedience, begin defying authority, that power at the top turns out to be very fragile. Generals become powerless when their soldiers refuse to fight. Industrialists become powerless when their workers leave their jobs or occupy the factories. Sixth, when we forget the fragility of power imposed from above, we become astounded when it crumbles in the face of rebellion. We have had many such surprises in our time, both in the United States and in other countries. Seventh, don't look for a moment of total triumph. See it as an ongoing struggle with victories and defeats, but consciousness of people growing over the long run. So you need patience, persistence, and you need to understand that even when you don't win, there is fun and fulfillment in the fact that you have been involved with other good people in something worthwhile. Okay, 7 pieces of profound advice should be enough. Howard Zinn. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to Ben Dangle, who will introduce us to Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. A lot of familiar faces out there. Nice to see everyone. Thanks, Anne, for that wonderful introduction. My name is Ben Dongle. I'm the editor of Toward Freedom, towardfreedom.com. It's a progressive news and analysis outlet focused on global events. It's based here in Burlington, Vermont. I know some of you have been writers and readers over the years. We're very honored to be one of the sponsors of this event and are very grateful to Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz for coming here tonight, and to everyone involved with the Will Miller Lecture Series who helped make this event possible. So TF is a publication that began in 1952, covering many of the anti-colonial movements of the era, and continues today with a wide network of reporters covering people's movements in Latin America, Europe, Asia, and Africa against war, corporate exploitation, inequality, and the climate crisis. We publish investigative reports unmasking the 1%, government corruption, and the broad reach of U.S. imperialism. But we also focus on alternatives to war and capitalism, standing alongside movements to offer a kind of people's newspaper of the world, a view from below and to the left, as the Zapatistas say. Most recently, we published an article on the Canadian government's genocide against Indigenous people. As Alexis Latham, the author of this powerful article, concluded, here in the United States, we have a far darker and deeper history of genocide to be reconciled. Which is one of the reasons why Roxanne's talk tonight, entitled The Indigenous People's History and the Roots of America's Endless Wars, is so crucial. Just as the conquest and colonization of the Americas were always met with indigenous resistance, the histories, the narratives of this conquest and colonization have always been a space of contestation, of power struggles. Some of these narratives silence others, perpetuate violence, provide a pretext for imperialism and endless wars. Other histories empower, liberate, challenge a colonization that has never truly ended. And there have always been chroniclers of these indigenous struggles, from Felipe Guaman Poma in the 16th century Andes, who provided one of the richest indigenous accounts of colonization and resistance in this region, to Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, who, with An Indigenous People's History of the United States and her many other wonderful books, has provided generations of current and future readers with a narrative, a counter-history that can be a tool of resistance, of liberation. Dunbar Ortiz grew up in rural Oklahoma, the daughter of a tenant farmer and part Indian mother. She has been active in the international indigenous movement for more than 4 decades and is known for her lifelong commitment to national and international social justice issues. After receiving her PhD at the University of California in Los Angeles, she taught in the newly established Native American Studies program at California State University, Hayward, and helped found the departments of Ethnic Studies and Women's Studies. Her 1977 book, The Great Sioux Nation, was the fundamental document at the first International Conference on Indigenous Peoples of the Americas, held at the United Nations headquarters in Geneva. Dunbar Ortiz is the author and editor of 7 other books, including Roots of Resistance, A History of Land Tenure in New Mexico, Outlaw Woman, a memoir of the war years, 1960 to 1975, Blood on the Border, a memoir of the Contra War, and most recently, An Indigenous People's History of the United States. She lives in San Francisco. Please welcome Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz.
Can you hear me? Good. This is the book. I've got a screen in front of me. There. I think I can see everyone except this corner here. Well, thank all of you for coming out tonight. Wow, there's standing room only. There are some seats around down here if anyone wants to There are people sitting on the floor. You can take a seat. I'm really honored to be speaking in memory and in honor of Will Miller. I feel very blessed to be one of the chosen speakers for this series, and I thank Ann Nipsett, Fred Magdoff, Ben Dangle, Ron Jacobs, and everyone involved in making this lecture possible annually and keeping the memory strong. It's important we remember our people who are dedicated to social justice and keep them in mind and keep learning from them. And I want to thank all the sponsors, the History Department, the ISO, who also has some books out. And I always like to mention the Unitarians, because Beacon Press, who published my book, and first published Howard Zinn's book too, is owned by the Unitarian Church, Unitarian Universalists. Are any Unitarians here? Oh, good. Well, thank you for being. They actually wrote, and it's on the Beacon website, a study guide for this book. And you can download it if you're a teacher or whatever. It's very, very good study guide. Before I begin, I had a wonderful couple of hours with the Vermont Worker Center this afternoon, and very moving. I'm very excited about that group's way of being and persistence to spread all over the country. And I want to call on Sonora from the center to tell about an event. I have a little card here, but she'll tell you about it coming up at the end of this month.
No.
You need the microphone, Sonora?
No, I can, yeah.
Oh my God. She's Emma Goldman.
Thank you, Roxanne. Hi, everyone. I see a lot of familiar faces. My name is Sonoma Fox, and I am a member of the Vermont Worker Center. And we are putting together this Vermont People's Convention on April 30th to May 1st. And there are going to be workshops and panels and youth summit and kids convention and people of color caucus and the May 1st rally. So all sorts of workshops and events happening, kind of focusing on, social justice movements in Vermont and how can we move forward with this work? How can we move forward doing movement building? So I have a few postcards, but also maybe Kate Candlestein somewhere. And some people in the back also have more postcards. So we'll be passing them out, and we would love for you to come. So
Thank
you.
you so much. So I want to talk about these endless wars and what's the source of them. That's really the genesis of this book. In a way, I started writing it in 1986 when I was doing Central American solidarity work in the middle of a counterinsurgency operations, by the U.S. government to overthrow the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, and jumping along, landmines. I am not a brave person, I tell you, but I felt committed to be there to witness. Not much could stop it. But I started writing a book I was calling Onward Christian Soldiers, the history of the U.S. military. So I started reading a lot of military history. And so it's been a learning process for me. So this book is sort of the distillation of what I've learned myself, and I try to follow it in such a way that it shortens the learning curve for this, because it's not that complicated, really. But it's not that simple either. So I wanted to talk about this blind spot of United States history. It's partly the invisibility or the making invisible of the people who lived in every inch of this land and cultivated it and oversaw it, or the stewards of this land have pretty much disappeared from, more or less, from people's minds in history. And how did that happen? And the most frequent question readers ask me about this book after they've read it is, why hasn't this book been written before? It's really a good question. And I'm always flattered. I mean, my first reaction, I'm so flattered, because it's the one I ask about books or articles or poems or whatever that deeply move me. At the same time, the information or argument or the story is new to me, but I feel like I already should have known it. It's in there somewhere in my subconscious, and it brings it out. Such a wonderful feeling. And it's a truth. So I knew the story I wanted to tell when I set out to write the book, but that didn't make it any easier to transfer to paper. That first effort, that 100 pages I wrote of U.S. military history, it was so dry, you would become dehydrated reading my academic discourse. So, writing and rewriting, I actually discovered this story. I had, been studying it, absorbing it, but I had to discover the heart of the story. And I think what my readers get when they read it is they discover that story that they already know or should have known. This book should have been out there all this time. But why hasn't this book been written before? We believe we don't suffer censorship in the United States, but we do. Rather than being mandated by the government, historians, U.S. historians, self-censor in response to institutionalized policing of the parameters of what's acceptable and what will be marginalized. William Burroughs, one of my favorite writers, his narrator in his great 1984 novel, The Place of Dead Roads, which I highly recommend, observes that, quote, people are not bribed to shut up about what they know. They are bribed not to find out in the first place. This is particularly true in the writing of U.S. history. It's not a free speech issue, but one of asking questions that challenge the core of the scripted narrative. Historians are validated to the extent that they remain guardians of the United States origin myth. And that can have many variations, as I show in the book. Many complain that even the educated general public do not know basic facts about the structure of government, the Constitution, the rights of states, and the division of powers. Yet there is widespread acceptance of the greatness and goodness of the United States, along with extreme mistrust of the government. You've noticed that lately. The military is the only unifying government institution in this country. and always has been. It's the only one trusted and loved, even when the Army itself was divided during the Civil War. And that is the blind spot. This is a militaristic state and society. It seeps into every part of our social relations. So why is there so little about the origins and development of the military in history in political science and history texts and teaching? The premise of my book is that from the earliest settlements in the 1600s to the adhesion of the 13 British colonies into an independent nation state, and up to the present, the military has been the engine of United States development and the core of patriotism. Yet generations have had little knowledge of and interaction with the military, or they couldn't romanticize it that much if they had. It is nearly invisible in everyday life. But the annals of military history reveal the architecture of its formation and function. That is what I discovered when I was struggling to write U.S. history from the perspective of Native nations' experiences. And it's what readers discover when they read the book and wonder, why hasn't it been written before? It's no secret, but akin to the king's new clothes. Air Force officer and military historian John Grenier isn't the first military historian to locate the roots of the U.S. military in English U.S. settlers' genocidal wars against Native nations, but his book, The First Way of War, is the most succinct, well-documented, and accessible for civilians. Fortunately, it came out in 2007, right when I was starting this book, and it was, boy, that saved me a lot of documentary research. He teaches at the U.S. Air Force Academy and is an officer in the Air Force. See, they teach themselves, they know this stuff within the military. So he writes, for the first 200 years of our military heritage, Americans depended on arts of war that contemporary, at that time, professional soldiers supposedly abhorred. Raising and destroying enemy villages and fields, killing enemy women and children, raiding settlements for captives, intimidating and brutalizing enemy non-combatants, and assassinating enemy leaders. In the frontier wars between 1607 and 1814, Americans forged two elements, unlimited war and irregular war, into their first way of war. So Grenier says, from this period emerged problematic characteristics of the U.S. way of war, and thereby the characteristics of its civilization, which few civilian historians acknowledge. There's a strong tendency in U.S. history writing to focus on the individual actor rather than individuals functioning within a system. Surely there are bad and good people in every society, and there's bad and good in every individual, but that doesn't tell us much except that social institutions can allow the bad in people to emerge or the good in people to predominate. That is, a society sets standards for behavior and isolates that which is considered bad. In addition to the good-bad binary, since the surge of the civil rights movement, historians writing U.S. history claim to be exploring warts and all, they love to say that, with balance, of course, with violence on both sides, good and bad people on both sides. But warts can be removed from the body and leave it intact, which is the kind of history which is this kind of history does. Here's an example of the matrix that is uncovered when a thread from the weave of consensus U.S. history is pulled. In July 2015, just last year, you may remember these events, but probably not this one because it's California. The California legislature, the state legislature's Black Caucus, called on the residents of Fort Bragg, California, the site of a former military base 170 miles north of San Francisco, to change the town's name. It was named after General Braxton Bragg. In the course of his long military career, Bragg, an 1837 West Point graduate, was commander of the Confederate Army in the Civil War and owned over 100 enslaved Africans. The Black Caucus rightly raised the issue in the wake of the Charleston, South Carolina assassination of senior pastor and state senator Clementa C. Pinckney, along with 8 worshipers at the oldest historical Black church in North America, Mother Emanuel. Shocked attention quickly turned to the continued presence of the Confederate flag on the South Carolina State House in Charleston, the assassin being a self-identified white supremacist whose internet photos showed him toting the Confederate flag. So very healthily, I think, a real national debate ensued. This doesn't often happen. Not only about the proliferation of Confederate flags all over the place in the South and in white supremacist enclaves all over the country, but also public monuments and place names, particularly Army bases named after Confederate officers. There are, in fact, 9 other U.S. military bases, in addition to Fort Bragg, that are named after Confederate officers. Most of them are in the South. And most of them were named during the Jim Crow era. Fort Bragg was actually named before the Civil War. Few in California were aware when this made headlines that Fort Bragg should, be named something else. Few in California knew that their state hosted a base, now a town, that was named after a Confederate general. We wouldn't do that in California. But the argument began immediately. Those opposed to changing the name pointed out, rightly, that General Bragg was a decorated Army officer in 1857 when Fort Bragg was built and named 3 years before the Civil War. So he was not a Union soldier, he was a United States soldier. That's certainly different from those bases in the South named after Confederates, which occurred in the 20th century. The naming honor recalled Bragg's heroic actions as a captain serving under Major General Zachary Taylor in the U.S. invasion and occupation of Mexico City in 1847. And the purpose of establishing Fort Bragg in the first place was to enforce the confinement of indigenous Californians forced into the newly established Mendocino Indian Reservation. So the Black Caucus statement asserted that it was inappropriate to honor an individual who committed treason against the U.S. government in defense of slavery by leaving the U.S. Army and supporting the Confederacy. Nearly everyone who has argued for the change of names of military bases has involved the charge of treason. Yet all of these West Point graduate officers who led the Confederacy, most of all Robert E. Lee, after whom the bases are named, have been honorably recognized for their feats in the invasion of Mexico, including Robert E. Lee, and several also in the wars against the Seminole Nation and the Everglades, 1816 to 1858, 3 Seminole Wars. So that's, a lot of war experience, sort of tracking Andrew Jackson's life. But it seems it would have been appropriate had these officers not chosen the Confederate side and stayed in the U.S. Army, in the Union Army, to slaughter Native Americans during and after the Civil War. Like every military officer of the Union Army, Sherman, Sheridan, Grant, Custer, to name the most famous. In fact, the majority of U.S. Army bases on the continent were initially outposts for wars against indigenous nations. Fort Snelling, Fort Kearny, Fort Leavenworth, in the 1820s, established in Missouri. Fort Sill, Fort Riley, the latter base, the base of George Armstrong Custer's 7th Cavalry, now the 1st Infantry Division, all named after U.S. Army officers who commanded genocidal wars against the Indians and Mexicans. For most of the period from the U.S. War of Independence to the 1890s, the sole function of the U.S. military was to kill, round up, create refugees, relocate, and confine Native Americans, and appropriate their land base and resources to place Anglo settlers, particularly slave-owning planters, involved in monocash production, crop production. The Army officers of both the Confederacy and the Union had made their careers in genocidal campaigns against Native nations and Mexico, annexing half of Mexican territory, and including 3 major wars against the Seminole Nation before the Civil War. Both Union and Confederate armies posted regiments west of the Mississippi to invade the territories of the Dakota, the Cheyenne, the Navajo, Apache, the Comanche, and other nations. Wars against the Native peoples did not miss a beat during the Civil War, after which it was total war to destroy the Native nations in the Northern Plains and the Southwest. 6 of the 7 divisions of the U.S. Army in the 1870s were in the what they called the Army of the West. So as Chickasaw scholar Jody Bird writes, that the colonization of American Indian nations, peoples, and lands provide the United States the economic and material resources needed to cast its imperialist gaze globally is a fact that is simultaneously obvious within and yet continually obscured by what is essentially a settler colony's national construction of itself as an ever more perfect multicultural, multiracial democracy. The status of American Indians as sovereign nations colonized by the United States continues to haunt that false story. Is this water?
It's for you.
Do I have a glass or do I have to drink out? I don't know how do these things work? I'll get my little bottle. My little bottle. It's tap water. I know I'm in Vermont. It's just like San Francisco. So the conventional narrative of U.S. history routinely segregates the Indian Wars, so-called, as a sub-specialization within the dubious category of the West. Western history. It's a new field that came out of the end of the frontier, supposedly. But the architecture of U.S. world dominance was designed and tested by the period of continental U.S. militarism, 1790 to 1890. Even during the 20th century, the opening of the 21st century saw a new, even more brazen form of U.S. militarism and imperialism explode on the world, followed by two major military invasions and hundreds of small wars, employing, now it's up to 70,000 special forces around the globe. One highly regarded military analyst, who's not a military man, he works for Stratford in Austin, that think tank, defense think tank. He's an advocate of counterinsurgency and was one of the people who argued for the new republication of the counterinsurgency manual, which you can buy on Amazon for 5 cents. Everyone should read that manual. So this Robert Kaplan, he makes direct connections between the so-called Indian Wars and what he considers the United States, quote, bright imperialist past and future. Kaplan, in his 2005 book, Imperial Grunts, presented several case studies that he considered highly successful operations: Yemen, Colombia, Mongolia, and the Philippines. Do you know we were at war with counterinsurgency in those countries? Yemen, maybe, you knew. In addition to ongoing projects in the Horn of Africa, Afghanistan, and Iraq. While many U.S. citizens and many of their elected representatives called for ending U.S. military interventions, the ones they knew about, including Iraq and Afghanistan, Kaplan hailed protracted counterinsurgencies that were taking place and still are today in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, Latin America, and the Pacific. Kaplan presented a guide for U.S. controlling those areas of the world based on having achieved continental dominance in North America by means of counterinsurgency and employing total and unlimited war. Kaplan became one of the principal intellectual boosters for U.S. power through the tried and true first way of war that Grenier talks about. So it's a military tradition that accepted, legitimized, and encouraged attacks upon and destruction of native villages and agricultural resources, what they called food fight at the time, starving people out by burning their crops and their granaries, and shockingly violent campaigns to achieve those goals. One of the chapters in his Imperial Grunts is titled Engine Country. He writes, by the turn of the 21st century, the United States military had already appropriated the entire earth and was ready to flood the most obscure areas of it with troops in a moment's notice. The Pentagon divided the planet into 5 area commands, similar to the way that Indian country of the American West had been divided in the mid-19th century by the U.S. Army. According to soldiers and Marines, Kaplan met on the ground in far-flung corners of the earth, The comparison with the 19th century was apt, he writes. Welcome to Indian country was the refrain I heard from troops from Colombia to the Philippines, including Afghanistan and Iraq. The war on terrorism was really about taming the frontier, unquote. In short, the war on terror is another Indian war. So was Vietnam. We're closer to understanding Vietnam as such in the 1960s, but that growing insight faded away, with the end of that war and didn't remain with, wasn't passed down, this understanding of what was happening in Vietnam. Kaplan goes on to ridicule what he calls elites in New York and Washington who debate imperialism in grand historical terms, whether it exists or not, while individuals from all the armed forces interpret policy according to the particular circumstances they face and are totally indifferent to or unaware of the fact that they are part of an imperialist project. To them, and for many U.S. Americans, United States military power is the heart of their patriotism, and the military is revered as no other government institution is. Pointing to the intentionality of U.S. colonialism in North America, Kaplan challenges the concept of manifest destiny, arguing, not that, he says that it was a wrong idea, but that it wasn't manifest, that it wasn't inevitable. He writes, it was not inevitable that the United States should have an empire in North America, in the North American continent. Rather, he argues, it was the work of, quote, small groups of frontiersmen separated from each other by great distances. Have any of you seen the film, The Revenant? I really recommend it because it is a visual expression of this in the 1820s, 1830s, when this was beginning what exists now. So Kaplan refers to what Grenier and what were called in the colonial period, rangers. And of course, when they established the first special forces under Kennedy, they called them Army Rangers. These were self-organized settlers who destroyed indigenous towns and villages and food supplies and murdering the inhabitants. Kaplan equates these settler vigilantes to the modern special forces. He acknowledges that the regular army provided then and provides now lethal backup for settler counterinsurgency and slaughtering the buffalo, the food supply of the plains people, as well as making continuous raids on settlements to kill or confine the families of indigenous resistance fighters. So Kaplan summarizes the genealogy of U.S. militarism today, which he admires. Grenier does not. He's very concerned about it. So quoting Kaplan, whereas the average American at the dawn of the new millennium found patriotic inspiration in the legacies of the Civil War and World War II, when the evils of slavery and fascism were confronted and vanquished, for many commissioned and non-commissioned officers, the U.S. Army's defining moment was fighting the Indians. It's interesting because my daughter, her father, my ex-husband, his niece, my daughter's first cousin, Ellen Nickmeyer, was Associated Press reporter in Iraq and then Washington Post. And because I know her and she's a friend on Facebook, I caught this article of hers, but it wasn't sent out by the Associated Press. I mean, it was sent out, but it was hard. It didn't get reprinted anywhere. You know, they send stuff out and papers can pick it up. It just didn't get reprinted, but she was there March 19, 2003. We just passed this anniversary of the invasion of Iraq. And she was in the Iraqi desert inside Kuwait. She illustrates the symbolic power of the Indian Wars as a source of U.S. military memory and practice. So she wrote, tank crews from the Alpha Company, 4th Battalion, 64th Armored Regiment perform what they call a Seminole Indian war dance before convoying to a position near the Iraqi border Wednesday, March 19, 2003. Captain Philip Wolford's men leap into the air and wave empty rifles in an impromptu desert war dance. With thousands of M1A1 Abrams tanks, Bradley fighting vehicles, Humvees, and trucks, the mechanized infantry unit known as the Iron Fist would be the only U.S. armored division in the fight and would likely meet any Iraqi defenses head on. So still quoting from her article, we will be, she's quoting the captain, we will be entering Iraq as an army of liberation, not domination. So he's from Ohio Valley, directing the men of the 4th Battalion. So after a brief prayer, a Christian prayer, Commander Wolford leaped into this impromptu desert war dance. Camouflaged soldiers joined him, jumping up and down in the sand, chanting and brandishing rifles carefully emptied of their rounds. So the Seminole war dance, serious business. They're recalling the Abrams tanks of the same division. They were created in the Second Seminole War. Of course, they were horseback. You know, they were not mechanized yet, but that's a genealogy. So they are. She didn't know this at the time. She was just being a good reporter. But that's their genealogy of this particular regiment. And it's pretty serious business as it's remembered in the U.S. military annals. The 3 declared wars, they were wars declared by Congress. You rarely see them mentioned in any history textbook, against the Seminole Nation in the Florida Everglades. Spanned a 42-year period, the longest war in U.S. history, from 1816 to 1858. The Seminole Wars remain deeply embedded in the U.S. military tradition and practice. So this is even what Kaplan misses. He's only seeing the U.S. Army in the West after the Civil War. It goes back to the beginning. In early 2011, a Yemeni citizen, Ali Hamza Balul, was serving a life sentence at Guantanamo as an enemy combatant. Remember, this is in the Obama administration. A military tribunal having convicted him of crimes associated with his service to Al-Qaeda as Osama bin Laden's media secretary. In arguing on appeal that Balul's conviction be upheld, a Pentagon lawyer, Navy Captain Edward S. White, relied on a precedent from an 1818 tribunal. In his 37-page military commissions brief, Captain White wrote, "Not only was the Seminole belligerency unlawful, but much like modern-day Al-Qaeda, the very way in which the Seminoles waged war against U.S. targets itself violate the customs and usages of war." So the Center for Constitutional Rights, who were trying their best to defend the Guantanamo detainee, objected to this passage in the government's brief, writing, The court should reject the government's notable reference of the Seminole Wars of the 1800s, a genocide that led to the Trail of Tears. The government's characterization of Native American resistance to the United States as much like modern-day Al-Qaeda is not only factually wrong but overtly racist and cannot present any legitimate basis to uphold Mr. Balul's conviction. In response, the Pentagon's General Counsel issued a letter stating that the U.S. government stood by its precedent. So, rather than bestowing the status of prisoner of war on the Afghan, the invasion of Afghan, on the detainees, which would have given them certain rights under the Geneva Conventions, they were designated as unlawful combatants and incarcerated in Guantanamo and other places. As such, the detainees were subjected to torture by U.S. interrogators and shamelessly monitored by civilian psychologists and medical personnel. Much of the rhetoric following the declaration of the War on Terror after the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2011 references U.S. militaristic memory of the wars against Native nations. In response to questions and condemnations from around the globe, a University of California international law professor, John C. Yu, on leave to serve as Assistant U.S. Attorney General in the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel, penned in March 2003 what became the infamous torture memo. That's not what they called it, but that's what we called it. Despite strong objections to the unlawful combatant moniker, not much was made at the time of one of the precedents that you used to defend the designation unlawful combatant. It was a U.S. Supreme Court decision of 1873 in Modoc Indian prisoners. In 1872, the Modoc leader, Kent Puash, also known as Captain Jack, led some 150 of his people to return to their own country in Northern California after the U.S. Army had rounded them up and forced them to share a reservation in Oregon. 53 insurgent fighters from the group were then surrounded by U.S. troops and Oregon militia and forced to take refuge in the barren and rugged lava beds around what's left of, which is nothing but lava beds of Mount Lassen, which just exploded completely, the volcano. But this is the part of their sacred homeland, and they knew every inch of it. More than 1,000 troops commanded by General Edward R.S. Canby, a former Civil War general, attempted to capture the resistors, but had no success as the Modocs engaged in effective guerrilla warfare. Before the Civil War, General Canby had built his military career fighting in the Second Seminole War and later in the invasion of Mexico. Posted to Utah on the eve of the Civil War, he had led attacks against the Navajos and then began his Civil War service in New Mexico. Therefore, Canby was a seasoned Indian killer. In negotiations between the general and Kent Puash, the Modoc leader killed the general and the other commissioners when they tried to imprison them and would not allow any resolution other than the Modocs' surrender and return to Oregon. In response, the Army Command dispatched another former Civil War general with more than 1,000 additional troops. Remember, these 59 Modocs. As reinforcements, and in April 1873, these troops attacked the Modoc stronghold, this time forcing the Modoc resistors to flee and many were captured, including Captain Jack. After 4 months of fighting that cost the United States the equal of, $10 million, and the lives of more than 400 of its soldiers and a general, the nationwide backlash against the Modocs and all Indians was vengeful. Kent Puash and several other captured Modocs were captured, tried, and hanged, and the Modoc families were scattered and incarcerated in reservations as far away as Oklahoma. Kent Puash's corpse was embalmed and exhibited at circuses around the country. So drawing a legal, that's the case. Drawing a legal analogy between the Modoc prisoners and the Guantanamo detainees, Assistant U.S. Attorney General Yu employed the legal category of homo sacer. In Roman law, this is a person banned from society, excluded from its legal protections, but still subject to the sovereign's power. Anyone may kill a homo sacer without it being considered murder. To buttress his claim that the detainees could be denied prisoner of war status, Yu quoted from the 1873 Modoc Indian prisoners' opinion. And the opinion read in part, "All the laws and customs of civilized warfare may not be applicable to an armed conflict with the Indian tribes upon our frontier." Thereby, anyone who could be defined as Indian could thus be taken and killed legally. And they also could be held criminally responsible for engaging any U.S. soldier in their own defense. So that is the legal situation still of the detainees and new ones that are being taken all the time. So Indigenous peoples in the rest of the world are treated, as were Native Americans, as impediments to U.S. military requirements. The Chagos archipelago comprises more than 60 coral reefs, islands isolated in the Indian Ocean, halfway between Africa and Indonesia, 1,000 miles south of the nearest continent, India. Between 1968 and 1973, during the Vietnam War, the United States and Britain, the latter the colonial administrator of the islands, forcibly removed all of the indigenous inhabitants of the islands. Most of the 2,000 deported Chagosians ended up more than 1,000 miles away in Mauritius and Seychelles, where they were thrown into lives of poverty and forgotten, and they're still there. The purpose of the expulsion was to create a major U.S. military base on one of the Chagosian islands, Diego Garcia. The base at Diego Garcia has become one of the most secretive and powerful U.S. military facilities in the world, helping to launch the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq twice, threatening Iran, China, Russia, and nations from southern Africa to Southeast Asia. And I expect none of you have ever heard of. Have you heard of it? Some of you have. There's actually a very good David Venter has written books and articles on it trying to get out this information about the Chagosians. They have never even been compensated. So it's also a host to a secret CIA detention center that we don't even know about, Guantanamo, secret Guantanamo, for high-profile terrorist suspects, and home to thousands of U.S. military personnel and billions of dollars in deadly weaponry. The U.S. military established a pattern during and after the Vietnam War of forcibly removing indigenous peoples from sites deemed strategic for the placement of military bases. The peoples of the Bikini Atoll in the South Pacific and Puerto Rico's Vieques Island are perhaps the best known examples. But there were also the Inuit of dual Greenland and thousands of Okinawans, Chamorros of Guam, indigenous peoples of Micronesia, and of course the Chagosians. And during the harsh deportation of the Micronesians in the 1970s, the press took some notice. In response to one reporter's question, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger said of the Micronesians, "How many people are there? There are only 90,000 people out there. Who gives a damn?" This is a statement of permissive genocide. So by the beginning of the 21st century, the United States operated more than 900 military bases around the world, not counting the ones in the United States, including 287 in Germany, 130 in Japan, 106 in South Korea, 89 in Italy, 57 in the British Isles, 21 in Portugal, and 19 in Turkey. The number also comprised additional bases or installations located in Aruba, Australia, Djibouti, Egypt, Israel, Singapore, Thailand, Kyrgyzstan, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Crete, Sicily, Iceland, Romania, Bulgaria, Honduras, Colombia, and Cuba, Guantanamo Bay. Also many other locations in some 150 of the 186 countries of the world, along with those recently added in Iraq and Afghanistan. So, we see the military all around us and in the media. I resent every time I get on an airplane that soldiers in uniform get to board first. But as military historian John Grenier notes, the U.S. militarization is not new. It's not something new. It has deep historical roots, reaching into the nation's Anglo-settler past and continuing through unrelenting wars of conquest and ethnic cleansing over 3 centuries. Grenier writes, beyond its sheer military utility, Americans also found a use for the first way of war in the construction of the American identity. The enduring myth, the enduring appeal of the romanticized myth of the settlement, not calling it conquest, of the frontier, either by actual men such as Rogers Raiders of this area, or Daniel Boone, real person, or fictitious ones like Nathaniel Bumppo of James Fenimore Cooper's creation, points to what D.H. Lawrence called the myth of the essential white American as hard, isolate, stoic, and a killer. That's pretty much how the world sees the United States. The astronomical number of firearms owned by U.S. civilians, with the Second Amendment as a sacred mandate, is also intricately related to militaristic culture. The militias referred to in the Second Amendment are those civilians who were mobilized to attack indigenous towns, burning their villages, taking their land. Everyday life and culture in general are damaged by ramped up militarization. And this includes academia, particularly the social sciences, with psychologists and anthropologists being recruited as advisors to the military, university departments, even the humanities, English, linguistics, everything, getting major funding from the Defense Department. Anthropologist David H. Price, in his indispensable book, Weaponizing Anthropology, remarks that anthropology has always fed between the lines of war. Anthropology was born of European and U.S. colonial wars. Price sees an accelerated pace of militarization in the early 21st century. writing, "Today's weaponization of anthropology and other social sciences has been a long time coming, and post-9/11 America's climate of fear, coupled with reductions in traditional academic funding, provide the conditions of a sort of perfect storm for the militarization of many disciplines and the academy as a whole." So quoting again Chickasaw scholar Jody Bird, whose book, by the way, I'll think of the name later. She writes, "The story of the New World is horror. The story of America is a crime." When I read this of Jody Bird's, I thought, what an incredible art project it would be to put yellow tape all around the United States, to have people in every part go to the borders, put this yellow tape like a crime scene. Because she's saying it's a crime scene. It's never been investigated properly. It's necessary to start with the origin of the United States as a settler state and its explicit intention to occupy the continent, and that this is written into the genetic code, the metaphoric genetic code of the society. And we don't bring that to consciousness, it keeps acting out for us, including the tremendous amount of violence within this country. So these origins also contain the historical seeds of genocide. Any true history of the United States must focus on what has happened to and with Indigenous peoples and what still happens to living Indigenous peoples. There's something that one Canadian scholar has called a race to innocence. It's what occurs when individuals assume that they are innocent of complicity in structures of domination and oppression. This concept captures the understandable assumption made by new immigrants, for instance, or children of recent immigrants to any country. They can't be responsible. They assume for what occurred in their adopted country. But neither are the citizens who were born here or who families go back generations, the original settlers. They're not guilty either. They didn't do it. Somebody leaned on the lights again. They're holding up the wall there. Even Andrew Jackson, Indian killers, if you're descendants of them, you're not responsible for what they did. Yet, in a settler society that has not come to terms with its past, whatever historical trauma was entailed in settling the land affects the assumptions and behaviors of living generations in any given time, including immigrants and the hatred of immigrants and children of recent immigrants. We need to make immigrants and migrants and children of immigrants understand that the colonialist past that exists, what they're buying into, what the responsibility they are assuming when they become U.S. Americans. They can choose to be settlers or they can choose to be resistors to colonialism, to change. So I'll end with this. Some of you may have heard of this, but I kind of doubt it. The Winchester Mystery House. Does anyone know about it? It's a living, to me, it's a living symbol of the genocidal history of the United States, as well as a kind of general subconscious knowledge of it. The Winchester Mystery House, so-called, is a privately owned tourist site in the Santa Clara better known these days as Silicon Valley of Northern California. It's 50 miles south of San Francisco. It's billed as a ghost house on billboards that start appearing in Oregon to the north and San Diego to the south. Sarah L. Winchester, the wealthy widow of William Wirt Winchester, built the Victorian mansion to avoid and elude ghosts, although there is no record of any ghosts ever having found their way into her home. It could be said, perhaps, that Mrs. Winchester's project from 1884 to her death in 1922 was a success. No ghosts. She likely was well aware of the widely publicized ghost dance in 1890, which led to the killing of Sitting Bull and the Wounded Knee Massacre. The dancers believed that the dance would bring back their people who were murdered by gunfire, Army gunfire. It makes sense that Mrs. Winchester felt the need to guard herself from the ghosts of those killed by the Winchester repeating rifle, which her late husband's father had invented and produced in 1866, right after the Civil War, with later models being even more lethal. Mrs. Winchester inherited the fortune accumulated by her husband's family through the sales of the rifle. There was one major purchaser, the U.S. Department of War, and that was what it was properly called then, before it was changed in 1948 to Defense. The chief reason for the War Department's purchase of the rifle in great quantities was to kill Indians. No other purpose. The rifle was a technological innovation designed explicitly for U.S. Army cavalry campaigns against the Plains Indians following the Civil War. The Winchester House amazes all who tour it. There are 5 floors, more or less, since they are staggered. Each room in itself appears normal, decorated in the late 19th century Victorian mode. But there's more than meets the eye in getting from parlors to bedrooms to kitchens to closets and from floor to floor. Numerous stairways dead end, and secret trapdoors hide the actual stairways. Closet doors open to walls, and pieces of furniture are really doors to closets. Huge bookcases serve as entrances to adjoining rooms. Part of the house was unfinished when the widow died, as she had construction workers building every day from dawn to dusk, adding rooms and traps until her death. So you go there and you see the unfinished part and the tools still lying there. They just quit the day she died. Visitors trekking through the widow's home are astounded and perhaps saddened by the evidence all around them of the fears and anguish of an obviously mentally disturbed person. Yet it is kind of an uneasy feeling, that it's completely focused on her being a crazy lady. Yet there is another possibility, a sense of the scaffolding that supports U.S. society, a kind of hologram in the minds of each and every person on the continent. Mrs. Winchester might have been more aware of the truth than most people, and therefore fearful of its consequences. Regardless, in continuing to find or invent enemies across the globe, expand what is already the largest military force in history, and add to an elaborate global network of 1,000 military bases, all in the name of national or global security, does not the United States today resemble Mrs. Winchester's constantly trying to foil her ghosts? The guilt harbored by most is buried and expressed in other ways on a larger scale as regeneration through violence, in Richard Slotkin's phrasing. So thank you.
supposed to be holding a microphone to help with hearing. Maybe I'll just stand nearby, just emceeing some questions and discussion. I don't know if this is the right one to use or not. Yes, it is. Yes, Juan Carlos.
Okay, what is your opinion about the military-industrial complex, named the missiles Tomahawk and the helicopters Apache, the war machine? What is your opinion about that?
The question, I've been asked to repeat the question, I hope I get them right, is asking Roxanne's opinion about the naming of some of the implements of the warfare machine, like the Tomahawk, the Apache helicopter, etc.
Yeah, well, I've conceived of it as fetishism. You know, a fetish. I'm writing a book now on the Second Amendment and about the fetish of guns in the United States. A fetish is a power, something that has power in itself, supposedly. You empower it. And it's a constant reminder of conquest, of defeat of the enemy. So the Washington Redskins and all the sports, sports is just a tiny bit away from military in terms of emotion, masculinity, if you will, or false masculinity, fighting. And there too you have this, these mascots and terms. So it's a part of mascotry, what we call mascotry, of making mascots out of the victims. And it's also body parts, the collection of skulls and bones. The Smithsonian Institute is the whole attic is filled with cataloged millions of pieces of human bodies, body parts, museums all over the country. And there's an act of Congress that Native Americans got through for repatriation, but they have to take the initiative. They have to hunt down these things. They have to. It's very hard, expensive with DNA, and also they've gotten back some findings, but not all. So a lot of these things were taken from graves, Indian graves, stealing of graves. So this goes way back too, and it's it's kind of a sickness. Fetish is considered a psychological illness, not fetish. Anthropologists call, native sacred objects fetish, but that's not the same thing. The Freudian fetishism is the is empowering the person through this object. So this mascot is like the Indian in the cupboard that the little boy takes out and plays with, that children's book series, best-selling. Creepy. It's creepy.
Anybody else? Yes.
Hi, I was wondering if you were a fan of Jared Diamond at all.
Oh, Jared Diamond's coming up again.
The question was, is she
Whether or not she is would be interesting to know. But he of course talks a lot about human genocide as being part of the human behavior, and that it has a lot to do with migration on the planet, and that it certainly didn't start here. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on that.
the question is about Jared Diamond and in general, but also about his feeling that genocide is part of the human experience, shall we say, from the very beginning, and that it didn't just start in America.
No, he says it did start in America, but America before Columbus. The savage instead of the romantic Indian. I think he's very destructive. I think he knows better than these things. The stuff sells because it basically is a race to innocence. Either that or you bring up the Roman Empire. Well, there have always been empires, this is just another empire. And anyway, it's collapsing. Any way to get out of looking at what happened. It's and then projecting in the past. The first chapter in my book is called Follow the Corn. The civilizations of the Western Hemisphere, I would say, as a counterpoint to Jared Diamond, to read 1491. Yeah, and I think that idea of the warlike savage is just, it's a European colonialist. They said this about Africans, they said about Indonesians. It's not limited to native peoples. And of course, his last book was on defiling the Papua New Guinea people. So I think there are many, many books of various kinds like that try to explain the past without just looking what is the most obvious problem in the world today, the United States of America, and what is its problem, and why isn't it getting solved? Why does it keep repeating itself? Why do we're never successful? Do you realize that there is no place in the world that has such a powerful labor movement as the United States of America in the late 19th century and early 20th century? There should have been a revolution here. And of course, there's repression, undoubtedly. My grandfather was in the Socialist Party in Oklahoma at that time, and also in the Industrial Workers of the World. He named my father Moyer Haywood Scarberry Pettibone Dunbar, after the wobbly founders. And I grew up with those stories. Well, why did they lose? Why did they lose? And he couldn't answer me. But what I've come to realize is that you cannot have settler democracy. You can't have a settler state that can liberate itself. You have to first decolonize. That's what Marx said about England. Until they let go of their colony of Ireland, that the English working class would not have a revolutionary consciousness as workers. So that's why I think we don't even have, lasting, persistent, strong trade unions. So I think it's absolutely essential that we simply bring all this up to the level of consciousness and think about it. Think about how, and it's amazing how much can change when you see the world in a different light. It's like a paradigm shift, of how to organize, what kind of consciousness. Like the whole idea of whiteness, like how did the Irish become white? How did the Jews become white? How did the Italians become white? Why white? How did they become settlers? They didn't become white, they became settlers. And anyone could be a settler. So after the Civil War, African American combat soldiers for the Union Army who fought valiantly and lost the most men, percentage-wise, their divisions. Many of them were given land grants in Indian Territory that had already, been the removal of all the people from the South. So they were settlers on Indian land. But also the Cherokees were brought and settled on Osage land. They were forced. But there's they had to deal with their it's a condition of colonialism, and we have to refamiliarize. We were familiar, some of you older people here, old as me, remember how we were reading Fanon in the 1960s, and the Black Panthers, for instance, of course the American Indian movement, Puerto Rican Independistas, were bringing all this to the fore. But it wasn't crystallized. It wasn't really understood in the ways that we can understand it now and realize that nothing's going to work and the whole earth is going to be destroyed itself if we here in the United States don't do something to change this society. I'm letting him go. And there's a hand back there that's been up for a long time too.
First that one, and then who's in the back? Oh, Paul. Yeah.
Me first?
Sure.
Okay. That was a brilliant answer to the question Jared Diamond. Thank you.
You're not a fan either, right?
I have a quick announcement and then a question. The announcement is on the April 14th Haymarket book event. And the Haymarket book tour events are kind of like this event here. They're a forum for radical education, discussion, debate on the left, including taking up persistent historical questions and issues. The April 14th event is with author and activist Sharon Smith, and it's called Women in Socialism, Class, Race, and Capital. And I'll just read the blurb. More than 40 years after the women's liberation movement of the 1960s, women remain without equal rights. If anything, each decade that has passed without fighting the women's movement has seen a rise in blatant sexism and a further erosion of the gains that were won in the 60s and 70s. Join in discussion with Sharon Smith, who takes up issues of women's oppression from a Marxist perspective, focusing on the centrality of race and class amid the stirrings of a new movement today. So if you didn't get a flyer, we'll be passing out flyers in the back. They're on the table here.
Great.
Is there a question?
Question. I really like the connection you drew between the war on Native nations and the war on terror. So the question is kind of two. What about Palestine? How do you understand that? Because it seems like in many ways Israeli occupation was the model and the ideology for the war on terror post-2001. And then also, what do you think about the possibilities of solidarity between the Black Lives Matter movement and the struggle?
Thank you. Good question.
It was a two-part question. One had to do with the Palestinian, the situation of Palestine and the Palestinians, and the other about the possibility of the Black Lives movement and the Native American movements getting together.
Yeah, what was the first one?
It had to do about Palestine.
Oh, Palestine.
Palestinian situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm not sure, about in the context you said, but there's a great solidarity between the Native Peoples movement in the United States and Canada in particular, and Palestinian self-determination, because Israeli settler colonialism was really 1948. It was patterned on the United States, exactly how the United States, rather consciously creating these little islands of separation, of colonization. And so it's a 20th century, late 20th century settler colonialism, but it has a parallel in South Africa with the Afrikaner, the National Party coming to power in 1948, exactly the same year, and also creating Bantustans, creating a whole system of Bantustans based on Indian reservations. So these are copycats, and their defense, you hear Netanyahu every other day say, if there's any criticism from anyone, anyone in authority in the United States, he says, well, how about you, United States and Mexico? Are you going to restore the half of Mexico you took? It's actually a good question. But he's only saying it as a taunt, of course, as why if, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. So U.S. settler colonialism is with the U.S. being the superpower and posing itself as this great moral authority. And in 1948, hardly anyone questioned that. After World War II, it was, this great power and the New Deal and all that. It was victory time. So patterning, so I put a lot of responsibility for how the Israeli state was conceived and patterned based on the US model. So you have almost a mirror image. I don't know if you've seen those maps of the loss of territory. We have one for North America, exactly like that, the gradation of the disappearance. Theirs is green, ours is red, disappearance. And so we're learning a lot from each other, and for me this goes back, it was like one of my first politicizing moments in Oklahoma. I grew up in rural Oklahoma, so I didn't know much about anything in the world, and least of all about even Native peoples right there in the county I grew up, because my mother had been an orphan, and not from Southern Cheyenne. That's the county I grew up in. So at the University of Oklahoma, there were a lot of Arab and Iranian petroleum engineering students, because that was the only petroleum engineering school in the country at the time. And one was Palestinian, and this was 1956, and it was only 8 years before that he and his family had been driven out of their homes. So he told the story as like a fresh traumatic experience. And he explained settler colonialism. And he said it's the first glimmering I had of what was around me. He says it's just like what happened to the Indians here, like here in Oklahoma. Well, I guess he thought I might have a connection with that and understand it. I said, that is news to me, that all of it was new to me. But building on that, understanding settler colonialism. And then a few years later, I also then got involved with the African National Congress in 1965 to, forever, in solidarity, anti-apartheid, and also learning about the settler colonialism there. So the other thing about these three, of course that's defunct in South Africa, but also Northern Ireland, the similarities is these are covenant states. They believe they have a covenant with God to be there. The Europeans, they always said they were helping people and had all the, but they never said they had a covenant with God to go steal India, or even, they themselves, the British authorities, it comes out of the pure. I have a whole chapter on the cult of the covenant in the book of the Puritan covenant, which started with the Mayflower Compact. So the Constitution is is the kind of covenant that's considered a sacred document. Most countries have, France has had 5 or 6 constitutions since the revolution. It's like you write a new constitution when the old one is no longer that operable. But not in the United States. It's sacred and it has to be word for word. Well, the other question about, what was it?
It was about the Black Lives Matter.
Black Lives Matter. There definitely is some great interaction in different places. Black Lives Matter, these wonderful, Alicia Garza comes from Oakland, and she has always been involved also with solidarity with Native people. So there's a lot of consciousness. And then when they confronted Bernie Sanders up in Seattle, I think it was, and kind of took over the stage, behind the speaker, the African-American woman was a Native leader. Also, they were involved, in that action. And both Bernie took up the issues and has hired people of their selection, including a Native advisor. So that action was condemned at the time by a lot of Bernie supporters, but I think what should be noted is how Bernie Sanders responded positively and actually got busy and learned what the issues were and spoke to them and publicized them. So I think Black Lives Matter is a very unifying, because this police violence, it's very similar. I haven't talked about that, but there's this parallel settler colonialism is, the system of slavery. And because the land was taken, the sacred land was taken and parceled up and sold as commodities. And the bodies of Africans were sold as commodities on the auction block. They were collateral for loans. So they're not just a labor system. It's much more than that, the colonial condition. So I think they're learning from each other, and in some cases relearning, because that was learned already in the 60s. The analysis of Frantz Fanon was what the Black Power movement was based on then. So I think it's the most important movement going on right now, really, and I don't think it's going to fade away. I think it is maturing and growing, and it's very a lot of autonomous parts to it. It's not an authoritarian. So it has a lot of creativity within it, and a lot of just unscripted actions. Some good, some bad, but still learning. Did you hear about on Martin Luther King holiday? They're stopping the Bay Bridge. It's the first time it's ever been successfully blocked by just simply parking their cars and chaining themselves to the cars. So the police knew there was going to be some kind of action because they were wiretapping and everything else, and looking at all their Facebook pages and everything. They knew something was going on. So there were like 200 highway patrol cars patrolling the bridge when they did that action. And they were able to do it, and simply for 2 hours completely shut down the Bay Bridge.
There's just one more question, and I know time is going, but I promise this person.
I wondered if you had read Susan Faluti's book. The name escapes me. It was about the aftermath of 9/11 and what I don't think her analysis is as deep as yours, but she talks about having a premonition about it, a man calling her up the day after it happened and say, well, now we won't hear so much from feminists anymore. And of course the TVs were flooded with generals. But she talks about this what she finds in these men is this, and she uses that, I think it's called The Searchers, a John Wayne movie, where Native Americans, steal a woman and bring her to, and she says that fear, and I think that's all projection, but I just wondered if you had seen that, right? But that was
it's a good book.
Another one of those ghosts and a way to keep it away, but also still driving that impulse to, get back.
I'm not sure I can repeat that.
We're having a conversation down here. Old feminists. Yeah, Susan Faluti's book, I was trying to think of the name of it, but it came out in, I think, 2004, 2005, which is a really good feminist perspective on this same kind of things I was talking about, but she also has some insights, I think, into the, like the Searchers, John Wayne thing of rescuing the white woman, from the savages, and that's very deep in colonial New England,
Right, and that men have such a terrible fear of this is going to happen.
Yes.
Even though, that's what was driving this insane patriotism.
Yeah.
It's called The Terror Dream.
That's it.
Oh, good. Thank you. Terrorist Dream.
Okay, well, I think
Thank you so
we're
much.
going to end this.
Thank you.